Hello, I'm Bill Berg. I'm a volunteer docent at the March Airfield Museum, and the airplane behind us is a KC-135 A model, which I started flying in Vietnam. The 135 is a refueling aircraft. It can refuel fighters, bombers, Navy, Air Force aircraft. I was born in 1942, and I served in the military from 1966 to 1996. So let's take a look at the airplane, and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go along. Okay, we're in the airplane now. This is a cargo door, which we can load any kind of cargo or put stairs up here for passengers to come in. And it's below the floor here is all fuel tanks. There are two big fuel tanks right below us right here, right now. The troop seats on the side, we can take about 100 passengers, 100 troops on board. And then we have sleeping facilities for the crews if they're going along missions. Either the troop seats can be used, or we can also put airline seats in for carrying passengers. The center, we can put all kinds of cargo all the way down through here, and quite often a person sitting here going somewhere with baggage or cargo right next to their knees, and all strapped down on the floor. Back in the back here we have called an auxiliary power unit. It runs on jet fuel, and it can provide heat and electricity to the airplane. In later models, they can actually start the aircraft themselves. This is the business end of the refueler. The boom operator lays down here on his stomach. And I'll give you an idea here. He controls the extension of the boom with this hand, and down below here is a stick that controls the wings back there. He can raise, lower the boom, fly it backwards and forwards, and once the receiving aircraft gets close enough, he extends it, plugs it into his receptacle. The co-pilot up front flips the switch, and the gases pass from the tanker to the receiver, either a fighter or a bomber or cargo. On the side here is where an instructor can lay to give the boom operator instruction during training. And we'll wander back up front, the driving end of it. The cockpit here, the boom operator is forward. He'll sit here. The navigator will be in this position, where he's got his radar, radios, all the navigation equipment. And then up front here, we have a pilot and a co-pilot. This is the pilot's area. This aircraft is actually called an A model. It's one of the first ones built. And it was built before the 707, which was modeled after this airplane by Boeing. So this is an A model. The Air National Guard had E models that used a bigger engine. And then right here at March Field, they're flying what they call R models that have way, way more powerful engines and can carry another 20,000 pounds of fuel a lot more economically. See, right now the aircraft flies with just two pilots and a boom operator. What you see right here is all your engine gauges, temperature, fuel flow, RPM, oil pressure. The flight instruments are same on both sides. Attitude, directional indicator, compasses, altimeters, airspeed indicators, and say they're duplicated on both sides of the aircraft, so either pilot has his own. The fuel panel here and the radar, this is a newer version of what the first one that I flew, where it's got electronics on it. It's got the ability to feed any engine from any tank or offload fuel to the receiver from the two center wing tanks. The overhead panel consists of your autopilot, radios, both left and right, the generator's electrical source, air conditioning, and pressurization. So, and way on the right there is the exterior lights, rotating beacon, position lights. And then down both sides are just the intensity you want your cockpit lights at. Say the airplane, when it's fully loaded, is about 300,000 pounds of weight. And that includes about 60,000 gallons of fuel that can be burned or offloaded. Okay, I'm at the navigator's position. You can get an idea of the panel that he had. The navigator, when we first started flying it, was very instrumental in your navigation. In 1970, I first started flying the airplane. The navigation was done by a sextant, taking a 3-star fix at night. The boom operator actually put a sextant up in a hole above here and get the position of 3 stars. Then he would wait a certain amount of time, get the same position of those 3 stars, and the navigator could plot his position within a matter of 4 or 5 nautical miles. So when you're going over water, you definitely had to have an excellent navigator and a boom operator for your navigation. When I first started flying this airplane at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, we were sitting on what they call nuclear alert. We would stay on alert with our airplane all loaded with gas for a 7-day period and be ready to launch in case Russia made some kind of offensive move. We would launch along with bombers and refuel the bombers on the way to their targets. I flew both Vietnam and Desert Storm. In Vietnam, we would take off from a base, whether it be Guam, Kadena, or Utapao in Thailand, and we would go up to a called an anchor area. We would rotate or orbit in about a 20-mile length pattern, racetrack pattern, and wait for the receivers, the fighters or bombers, to come up from southern Vietnam and get their fuel load, and then they would fly north to their target in North Vietnam, even all the way up to Hanoi. Once they dropped all their bombs or did their strafing, they would come back to us, get enough fuel to get back down to southern Vietnam, and then press on. Quite often we would have an airplane that was in trouble coming back from North Vietnam. It would have to fly north in order to pick him up. Sometimes we ended up almost towing aircraft back that had engine damage. But we had that mission, plus we did a radio relay mission with about 10 radio operators in back over the Gulf of Tonkin, to where we could actually see Hanoi as we hit the north part of the orbit. But we always had F-4s or fighters above us as our cap. Okay, let's start. We're ready to start the engines. We end up flipping on a switch that puts air into the engine. Once the engine spools up, we take it off, introduce gas and electricity. The engine spools up, and then it's at idle. Now for takeoff, we've got all the engines running, like so. You pull onto the runway, and you use a nose wheel steering, much like the B-17 has. It's a little round handle over there. and that's the nose wheel steering. And it just goes back and forth like this to turn left or right. So you pull on the runway, get cleared for takeoff, and there's water augmentation with this. It has about 500 gallons of distilled water in the wheel well to augment the thrust of the engine. And it takes them from about 9,000 pounds of thrust up to 13,000 pounds of thrust. So once you get ready for takeoff, you advance the engines and you put start on the water. That starts injecting the water and giving more power. On takeoff roll, you both call 80 knots at the same time. And then there's a critical engine failure speed, which is usually about 130 knots at fairly heavy weight. Once you get past that 130 knots, you're committed to take off. If you lose an engine, you have to shut it down, but you still have enough power to get airborne in the rest of the runway. Once you get airborne, you pull up the gear, and your water runs out, you drain it. Then if you had an emergency, you'd end up declaring emergency, coming back around and land on 3 engines. If you're a heavy weight, you can actually dump fuel out of the boom while you're flying to get your weight down to a manageable weight. Come back in, and you end up dropping your gear, your flaps to a landing condition, and fly the approach at about probably 130 to 140 knots. Come down within about 500 foot a minute to the runway. Once you get within about all 5 feet of the runway, you go ahead and pull your power back to idle. Bring the nose back about 5 degrees, and then wait for touchdown and apply the brakes very gently. Actually, in our refueling, like I say, we had what they call anchors. There was peach anchor, orange anchor, we call it the fruit bowls in Vietnam, and we would fly about a 30 to 35 mile orbit. When the receivers come up, we would fly directly at them, and when we got to about 17 degrees, we would turn in front of the receiver, and with any luck at all, he'd roll out with about 5 miles behind us in trail. At that point, the boom operator would acknowledge that he has him in sight, and the boom operator would take over, talk to the receiver, and talk him all the way in. During Vietnam, usually we had at least 4 receivers, F4s, F100s. They didn't have the F-15s at that point yet, so I think probably the newest airplane we had was the F4 we refueled. During Desert Storm, a whole different story. We had all the new airplanes that would refuel. If we were refueling Navy airplanes, there would be a big basket hooked down to the boom that was probably about 8 feet in diameter, and he would come up with his own probe and plug into the basket and get his fuel that way. The KC-135 is the only place in the Air Force where an enlisted man, the boom operator, had 3 officers, a navigator, and 2 pilots drive him to work while he lay on his stomach and passed gas. As I said, I pulled a nuclear alert at Barksdale in the late 60s, 69 and 70. And then later on, when I was in a different job in the 90s, I went back to that same base where I sat nuclear alert in case the Russians were aggressive. And at that time, we were having a bomb competition where we had different aircraft come in to compete, see how well they can refuel and bomb electronic targets. Well, we had some Russian bears come over from Russia with the air crew, and I ended up sitting in the same barracks where I pulled alert for a year or so, drinking Russian vodka with the Russian pilots themselves. and told me that they'd always planned on visiting us, but not in this nice way. This is a yoke which you end up making the airplane go up or go forward, left, or right. Now, some of the things we have on here, this right here changes your heading bug on your directional indicator. So if you want to go to a certain heading, like this little orange thing here, you slew this around there from here to there, and then turn the wheel, and the little line here would end up, once you got lined up in that heading, would come underneath the airplane. On the other side here, a little button to just talk on the radio, whether it be intercom or across the air. And this is your trim switch that would trim the airplane up or down. And as you spun, say, trimmed up, this wheel, which is a manual trim wheel, which you can maybe pull out sometimes, nope, and you can actually manually trim the aircraft that way. Okay, this is your autopilot controls. Once you turn the autopilot on, in fact it's on all the time, you just engage it when you're ready to use it. And if you want to go left, you just turn the knob left, turn the knob right. If you want to go up, trim up, like so, or go down, forward. The autopilot is very useful. It's a fairly good autopilot, even though it's a fairly old one. In fact, they're still using the same autopilot in today's airplanes. Normally, you can either refuel with autopilot on or autopilot off. If you're refueling small airplanes, I just usually left it on. If I was refueling a large airplane, I would rather fly with autopilot off, where I could actually feel the aircraft come underneath. Because as the aircraft comes underneath, you can imagine a C-5, a big, or a C-17, as it came up underneath you, it actually made you tip up a little bit. So you had to react to that. By trimming the aircraft back, I do it manually. And then all of a sudden, if he dropped off the boom and fell back, you get a violent, almost reaction like this with the autopilot, where if he had the autopilot off flying manually, I could control a whole lot better than the autopilot could. But most of your flying time was done on autopilot on, except for your landings and takeoffs. Especially if you're going a long distance, like I mentioned, we had a 12-hour mission on station just south of Hanoi, and everybody got to fly the airplane. Crew chief, boom operator, navigator, even a radio operator once in a while. And you'd come up and you just have him sit in the right seat, and he would fly for 20 miles, make a left-hand turn, go back the other direction for 20 miles, make a left-hand turn, and we did that for a total of 12 hours on every mission. It was 12 hours on station and about 3 hours to get there and 3 hours to get back. So we ended up with a 20-hour mission by the time we got back to, and that time we were flying back into CCK, or Taiwan. So that's the KC-135 that is being flown by the reserves. They have 10 airplanes assigned over there, and they usually have 3 or 4 gone all the time refueling somewhere around the world. They also fly training missions almost every day, where they will go up, meet a receiver, some kind of either a fighter or a C-17, and refuel them at about 25,000 feet. Then the KC-135Rs would come back. They'll shoot 3 or 4 approaches, may do some 3-engine approaches for emergency procedures, and do instrument approaches down to minimum for pilot training. Okay, these are all the different circuit breakers that control electronic equipment in the airplane. There are probably about 200 circuit breakers back here, and we don't know exactly where we know where the groupings are, so if we need to find something, like the generator is giving us problems, we can pop a circuit breaker on the generator giving us a problem. Engine ignition, engine start. So these are mostly all the engines items here. And back here is the air conditioning and pressurization. It has 3 like generators, and these are all the generator controls items. If you have to isolate anything, and like I say, if something goes wrong with something, they pop out like so. And if you check it out what the problem is, and then try to reset them to see if you corrected the problem. The crew entry hatch here that we came up in, this is where the crew would actually bail out of the airplane if they need to. They would lift this other grate, they would pull this chinning bar down like so, and this shield would drop down to block the wind for them to parachute out of. When this is down, they would reach over, we put this down so I don't, and grab a hold of it like this, and then release themselves out of the airplane. Once they got out of the airplane, they could pull the ripcord to open up their parachute. There's only been one instance of a KC-135 crews bailing out, and that was an airplane that was running out of gas, and a few of the people didn't think they'd make the runway. As it was, the pilot bounced onto the runway. I knew the navigator on that, and they asked him why he bailed out, and his comment was, there was a madman at the control, and we were a flying glider. So, anyway, the guys that left got in trouble. The guy that saved the plane, which is the cause of it, got promoted. Now they're in equity. In order to get the airplane button back up again, we'll end up putting the aft hatch in. Sometimes it can be tricky, and sometimes you get lucky. If they had to jump out of the airplane, they could jump out on the ground here. There's an escape rope here that they could pop open, and they can actually throw it out the door and then go hand to hand down the rope. Okay, if you had to evacuate the airplane, go out in the wing for some reason, you'd pop this door down, and lo and behold, there's the wing you can walk out on. Like I say, they don't always, they fight you sometimes. Tell you what, this shows how the airplane can be loaded. Like boom power will be back here, underneath this area. The auxiliary power unit. And these are all items that could be taken right in and tied down. They could even put an engine up in this part of the airplanes. Okay, now let this down. And this one closes a lot easier than it opens. Release the hydraulic pressure, and it gets very dark. Okay, here's how we get in the KC-135 here at the museum, although it was quite the same when you flew it. Quite often you also had a padlock. We're a strange base. We don't want people inside the airplane. So we pop the padlock off, or sometimes we just had a key entry. Open the release. That lets the door open up. Put in a safety item. And then pull the ladder, which we store up inside. lock the ladder in place, and then we're ready to go up. Okay. Here we are leaving the airplane. Come down the ladder. Release the ladder. Stick it up inside, make sure it's all the way there so the door will close. Release the safety catch. Swing the door shut. And lock it. And we'll find a padlock here. And the aircraft is secure. Okay, this is a KC-135, like I mentioned before, an A model. And this is aircraft number 553130, which meant this was actually made in 1955. The first two digits being the year it was made. This is old granddad. It was actually stationed at Carswell Air Force Base in Texas. So, on a walk around, pilot with a checklist in hand, which I don't have. We'll check the nose gear area, make sure there's no leaks. And there's a gear safety pin in there you'd take out, and you'd hand it to the crew chief as he walked around with you. Moving around this side, make sure that these were right. The pitot tube is not blocked in any way. Yeah, it's going to be a cloud, isn't it? And walking along just the general condition of the aircraft. Go up. Check the engines. Make sure there aren't any nicks or any problem with the blade or anything that doesn't belong inside here, which there should be nothing in here at all. And you check both engines. You can also come around to the back and check the turbine blades. Make sure they're none missing or none nicked, all in good condition. And into the wheel well. As you can see, these tires will fold up right up inside here. So you remove a down lock, it should be there. A big red item so the doors won't go closed while you're working at it. You check the fuel panel here to make sure everything was open so you could run fuel from any tank to any engine or offload. You close that up. You make sure this handle is down in the bottom position. That is your refuel position. If you're refueling the airplane, it goes up. Here's where the fuel nozzle fuel hose hooks into to refuel the airplane. You check for any obvious leaks up through the wheel well. And if you see the little receptacle up there at the very top, that's where you put clean, demineralized water. 670 US gallons. And that would last about 120 seconds on takeoff. Okay, checking tires for any problems, any bald spots or cuts might be. And around to the business end of the airplane. This is where the boom operator lays. You can see where his window is there. And he's got a series of mirrors. He can look at a mirror on top, a mirror on bottom, to see out the back, to see his receivers coming in. When the boom operator is guiding him in, he'll talk him in, or there's actually lights on the bottom of the airplane where he can tell him to come forward, go aft, come up, or go down. Once the receiver is hooked into the boom, locked in, the lights are automatic. The receiver goes too far left or too far right, it'll tell him to come back. It'll also kick him off the boom, disconnect if he gets too far out of limits. The boom you see here is a flying boom. This is a high-speed boom. In other words, you could refuel the fastest airplanes with it. And if you look down in here, there's the business end. This whole part here extends out about 20 feet. And once it hooks into the receiver airplane, he's got little toggles that sort of grab a hold of it to get a good hold on it. And as you're going around, you also check the condition of all the elevators, rudder, make sure there's no damage, nobody's run a truck into them. And up the other side, again, just looking at the general condition of the aircraft. And again, you check the engines for the same kind of problems. Any turbine blades or inlet blades that may be chipped or any items in there. And coming in the other wheel well, again, just checking for any hydraulic leaks. And this is a downlock that was missing on the other side, where it goes in to keep the doors from coming up. And then you also remove the gear pins. This comes out. That's a safety device to keep the wheels from collapsing while you're on the ground. Or if you have to fly somewhere and have to leave the gear down because of malfunction of some type, you would fly with that actually in position, holding the gear down while you're in flight. And that really is what you look at as far as the aircraft condition. It takes about the same amount of time we took right now to do it. Then you go up inside and you do the pre-flight on the inside of the aircraft. It's been very much of a pleasure for myself to be here today and show you the 135. I love flying it. It was just a fantastic airplane, and it's even better now. And they are going to replace it in the next few years, I believe, with a Boeing 767. So, thank you very much. Good day.